Well, good evening, everybody. I saw you in the afternoon, and now I see you at the sun setting. Thank you all for sticking around, and I see some new faces with us. I won't bore everybody with a long lecture about the history of the Society, but for those of you that are new, I want to welcome you to our event. My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the CEO of the APS, and we're in for a real treat tonight with Scott Edwards and his lecture. Before we start, though, I do want to say a few words about the Society for those that are joining us, and for those that sat through my talk, maybe some new information, and it has to do with the motto that you see here on the seal that's staring at you. And it says, the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And that's actually our full title, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And that's our mission. And we promote knowledge through a variety of different programs. We have the longest continuously operating press, which you see back there. If you're interested in our books or in publishing, I'd encourage you to be there. We've been claiming to be the longest continuously operating press for over 100 years, so it must be true. We also have amazing convenings like the night tonight, and I encourage you all to check out our events. Almost everything we do can be streamed online, so please make sure you check out our programs and participate that way if you can't join us in person. We also have a library, 14 million pages of manuscripts. It's an incredible archive. Many of our materials deal with anthropology, deal with field work, so it may be of interest in your own work, and the library itself might be a home that you want to think about for your own notes and records here at the Philosophical Society. Our motto is nullo discrimine, and that means that we don't discriminate. We celebrate all fields of knowledge, and I think that driving mission is embedded in the program today. We are traveling across the globe with presentations, across disciplines with presentations, and tonight our lecturer is one of our members, an elected member of the Society, and his talk, I think, is going to reflect that as well, talking about birds and biology. Scott Edwards, a member of the Society. So if you don't know Scott, he is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology and Curator of Ornithology in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. Scott is an evolutionary biologist with diverse interest in molecular evolution, phylogenetics, comparative genomics, and population genetics. His research uses birds as model systems, focusing on their evolutionary history, genome evolution, and genetic diversity. And I think a lot of that's going to be touched on in your talk tonight. Scott has held a variety of other roles. He has been president of the Society for the Study of Evolution, the Society of Systematic Biologists, and the American Genetic Association. He served on the National Geographic's Committee for Research and Exploration, and he currently serves on the advisory boards of the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. For 2 years, he served as the division director of the biological infrastructure at the National Science Foundation. And in recognition of all of his scientific accomplishments, he's elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and of course, in 2020, to the American Philosophical Society. The Society has, yes, the Society, we say, is the smallest of the learned societies. What that means is it is the most selective. We elect only 25 members a year in 5 classes, so only 5 members are elected in the biological sciences, and Scott was one of those. And I'll tell you a little story about Scott, something he doesn't know. So we have a very formalized ritual when members are inducted into the Society. There's a performance that is played out on this stage, and the new member comes up. They have to stand here before an audience as we read off all of their accolades, and they have to sit here smiling. And then they have to shake the president's hand, and then they have to sign the roll book, and then they walk off. Now, it is very choreographed, and we tell all of our members what they're supposed to do in what order. And these are, of course, some of the smartest people in the world. And 9 times out of 10, this fails miserably. You know, they don't know which way to go, where to look. So we decided, you know what we have to do is for new member orientation, this is before the event, we want to show them a model of how this ceremony is performed. So we had to go through our archive of all the meeting talks to find the one person who did it right. And that person was Scott Edwards. So, Scott, come back up on stage.
Wow, I did not know that, Patrick. That's, I mean, yeah, I'm one of the masses, though, that just basically loses all the instructions from their head when you're on the stage, right? You just, your brain goes blank. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you again, Patrick, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Linda, for organizing this amazing symposium. It's really been great to connect with colleagues and meet a bunch of new colleagues. I think the best part of the APS is just the interdisciplinarity. And yeah, don't tell my friends at other societies, but this is definitely the coolest society. I mean, just really exciting interdisciplinary, symposia, lots of stuff online that everyone can participate in. And so, yeah, I encourage you to look at the website, see what's going on. So yeah, I'm really excited to sort of, be the keynote for this symposium. And fieldwork is one of those things that's really influenced my career. And yeah, I'm looking forward to telling you just how I've navigated it as a ornithologist, and in particular as one who works in museums, and describe some of the challenges and also just some of the successes and ways we're trying to archive biodiversity in the broadest sense. This is my lab group for folks that may not know me. As Patrick mentioned, I'm a curator in the Museum of Comparative Zoology, so here we are earlier this year. And as you'll see vignettes of, we've done a lot of field work all around the world, but myself a lot in Australia. And as research, we use genetic techniques to understand the evolution of birds in the broadest sense. And a lot of our questions come from the field. They come from understanding of natural history. And, it's always been walking a bit of a tightrope as to how deep do you go into the genetic side, how deep do you go into the natural history side. And the great thing is members of my lab, and you'll meet a few of them in my talk, span the whole gamut, really. So a colleague of mine named Kevin Winker, he's an ornithologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, published a personality statement in one of his recent papers. And now, those of you in the social sciences might probably know what this is. I didn't really know what it was. Kevin has been engaged in this controversy about whether we should change the English names of our birds. Some of you may be aware that there's a movement to change the names to non-eponymous names, naming birds for things other than people. I think there are lots of birds in North America who are named after kind of bad people, but there's also birds that are named after pretty good people. So Kevin's been involved with this controversy, and really interesting to me, he ended his paper on the top one there on critical communication with a personality statement. This was basically, apparently this is practice in social sciences. You want to divulge your perspective, your history, where are you coming from, to that might shed light on what you're about to write. This is not something we do routinely in biology. And I was just basically very impressed that Kevin did this. I don't necessarily agree with all his views in whether we should change bird names, but I was very, he generated respect in the sense of, confessing what his history was. And so I figured I would do the same thing for you, so you kind of know where I come from, because I think that'll influence my perspectives on fieldwork. So I wasn't exactly a country boy. I believe very strongly that early exposure to nature, to the outdoors, and learning to navigate the outdoors from an early age is very important in influencing whether someone becomes a scientist or whether someone's comfortable in the field. I moved to a fairly early age to a pretty idyllic suburb of Manhattan called Riverdale. I worked at this amazing environmental center called Wave Hill. You can see the Hudson River there, the Palisades of New Jersey across the way. And you know, I spent many a wonderful day, not only on the beautiful grounds, but rumbling through their archives. They have a really interesting set of bird archives going back a long way from the local area. Another one of my big influences as a kid was none other than National Geographic. I'm sure many of you in this room relate to this. You know, I drunk the Kool-Aid of National Geographic. It was a magazine that my family just got. I still subscribe, and you know, it took me around the world. Right? I still find it a really wonderful resource to be that armchair explorer and to visit cool places that I will probably never get to. Now, that said, I'm sure many of you in the room are sensitive to the fact that, you know, National Geographic has been questioned, like many institutions in our country. National Geographic's motives and mission and values have been questioned. And I dug a bit into some of the research by John Edward Mason, a historian at the University of Virginia, who was tasked with reviewing National Geographic, particularly in the pre-war, World War II period, as to what was it actually like and what were its values. I've put some of his quotes from an interview up here. And, you know, he opens by saying that, you know, I think so many of us, even those of us who grew up African American, experienced this magazine as a part of our childhood. We consumed it pretty uncritically. I certainly wasn't thinking about the political ramifications of reading about distant cultures when I was cozying up to it in my bed. But he also confesses that it took him places that he'd never been and probably will never go. Did National Geographic play some kind of role in his becoming a historian of Africa? Probably, right? And certainly for me, being a biologist and ornithologist. He did point to a glaring sort of gap in coverage in National Geographic in the pre-war periods at a time when many countries in the global south were trying to achieve independence. Many voices, for example, in South Africa were pointing to the egregiousness of apartheid. National Geographic tended to cover the sort of glossy, positive aspects of history unfolding before them, as opposed to the more challenging, politically fraught areas. And so that's one area I think. I think today they have caught up substantially, and I think they cover many different viewpoints. But this was one area where Mason saw that they were lagging behind somewhat. So I grew up in New York City, as I mentioned, and these two museums, which those of you who are into museums will recognize, we've got the Smithsonian on the left and American Museum of Natural History on the right, played a huge influence in my upbringing. I spent most of my last semester of high school at the American Museum digging up old records of Riverdale, New York. And you know, as I'll tell you in just a bit, I sort of sought refuge from organic chemistry in the museum on the left. And in fact, it was in the Smithsonian where I was exposed to what a working collection did, what scientists did. I learned how to prepare specimens from Roxy Laybourne, a renowned ornithologist. And so museums have been in my blood for a long time. Now, as to my brush with organic chemistry, yeah, it was the kind of thing where I was like, Dad, I need to get out of school, because it was the most demoralizing, demeaning experience, and it was the only C on my transcript. I mean, in all seriousness, though, I worry still that organic chemistry drives a lot of talented kids out of science. I've looked at a lot of transcripts, and it's inevitably the lowest grade on their transcript. Why is that? I think many of us know the reasons. There's a certain amount of weeding that goes on, a certain amount of bravado. It's a real problem that we need to fix. But the silver lining here is that as a result of having taken it, I skipped out of school, spent about 6 months at the Smithsonian, and then I went back to my place of birth because I wanted to see it from a budding scientist's eyes. And so I went back to Hawaii, had some amazing experiences working with endangered species. I went out to the leeward Hawaiian Islands looking at albatross, which I still study today. And I came back from that year off with much more of a laser focus of what I wanted to do. There was a clear path. I knew I was excited about research. I even got some advice from colleagues at Berkeley about who was at Harvard at the time, whom I could work with. I ended up going to work with a wonderful scientist named Rodney Honeycutt. And I did my undergrad thesis on the phylogeny of African mole rats. I didn't go to Africa doing the field work. That was for Rodney. But it got me excited about the whole paradigm of using genetics, DNA, to look at how species have evolved, how they're related to each other. I knew, even as an undergraduate, that New Guinea was the epicenter, the sort of mecca for ornithologists, the home of the amazing birds of paradise. And I got an opportunity to work there for a few months. It really opened my eyes to sort of expeditionary field work. I will confess, just the thrill of going to a faraway place where people are speaking a different language, it was all very, very exciting. It started me off on my dissertation research, which focused on these birds right here, these babblers. I did a sort of continent-wide phylogeographic study of these birds. And it really set my path really for the next few decades in emphasizing some of the extraordinary radiations that came out of Australia and New Guinea. During my PhD, I had the good fortune of working with a very innovative scientist named Alan Wilson. He's there on the right. And he, of course, along with Becky Kahn, who's seen here, I just caught up with Becky just a few weeks ago in Hawaii. She's retired but doing really well. She is mitochondrial Eve, right? She is the one who built this extraordinary portrait of human diversity using mitochondrial DNA. In her case, she wasn't doing field work so much as trying to salvage placentas from women who had just given birth in the Bay Area from different ethnic groups. And through these resources, she made this transformative image of human diversity, which essentially set the stage for the next several decades of research in the area. She showed, for example, that humans were much more closely related to each other than we imagined they might be. Of course, there were quasi-racist theories saying, oh, no, different races, we go back at least 1 million years, right? Becky's research showed that no, in fact, we're far more closely related than different populations of your backyard snake or rat. She also showed, that human diversity originated in Africa. And the diaspora out of Africa led to a big bottleneck, which is one of the reasons why humans have so little genetic diversity. And so it was just a very exciting time. People in Alan's lab studying humans, studying ancient DNA. Svante Pabo was there, who just won the Nobel Prize. So it was a really exciting time. Now, the field that I chose to enter, namely genetics or genomics, it's a young field, but of course, it's a bit of a lightning rod itself. The word genomics, of course, people used to do genetics, but of course, when it came to being able to access information from across the entire genome, all of the chromosomes, it sort of morphed into genomics. And many of you are familiar with, different instances of overreach or aggressiveness or lack of consultation among geneticists trying to get their prize samples. Here's one small example from the Havasupai, who it was a case where a researcher, they wanted to learn why the rate of diabetes was so high in their communities. And so they gave precious samples to geneticists to help them figure that out. Those same samples were then used without consultation for completely other purposes. And this erupted in a big firestorm. But of course, genetics is, human genetics in particular, has had its issues, just in terms of who we're sampling, who we're putting our resources into. And so as many of you know, I'm sure there's a huge Western bias in how disease genetics is conducted, European populations being overrepresented. There's increasingly now efforts to sample all of human genetic diversity, but of course that was a very slow ramp up. And there's also this, I won't go into technical details too much, but suffice it to say that for the past 20 years, human genetics has been conducted in a way in which we have to choose an exemplar of our species, one individual that we're going to call the reference. That's the individual to whom everyone else in the planet will be compared. Who's going to be the reference? That's a pretty exalted position, right? Well, interesting times, there's new approaches now where we're moving away from having any single reference. We're able to use a diversity of individuals in a population to make a so-called pangenome, which will allow much more unbiased comparison among individuals. So, but for both ethical reasons and just serious blinders on, genetics has had a challenging history, not to mention, of course, the deep history going back to eugenics. But so that's one of the challenges, I would say, as a field biologist, is using these tools which, you know, speak in many cases directly to people's identity. And so we need to treat those very powerful tools with caution. I won't talk about it much now, although I do talk about it a little in my contribution paper, but I've often, this is some photos during my dissertation, you know, I think about what's the intersection, if any, of African American doing field work. It's, you know, honestly, I grew up in an era when, at least consciously, we weren't thinking about identity as much, I think, as young folks do now. But on the other hand, it's also the case that, you know, field biology is still not as diverse as we would like. So anyway, the main thing, I just wanted to point out that I think on balance, being African American probably was an asset. There's a lot of being written these days about, and I think with good reason, about challenges of people of color doing field work, just difficulties of navigating and being in places where people don't expect you to be, right? With binoculars, skulking behind the bushes, right? But I will say that, you know, these sorts of things apply to any marginalized groups, women, et cetera. I also think that it's not only minorities that suffer those consequences. My good friend, Michael Reed, who's a professor at Tufts, he told me that on our Christmas bird count in Concord, someone called the police on him. He was simply bird watching with binoculars, and he's white, white male. But, you know, and so these things happen, and part of it is just because field biology requires us to be in weird places doing weird things, or at least things that people think are strange. In my case, you know, in New Guinea, they would always ask me if I was from the Markham Valley, which is a valley near the city of Leh on the north coast where people are really tall. Because, you know, without my backpack on or without my binocs, I look kind of like a New Guinean. And so that was always fun. And, you know, I will say in Australia, it was, and maybe this was a function of doing a lot of work there back in the 80s, it was extraordinary, the positive reception I received, literally knocking on people's door in the outback, asking if I could harass the birds on their property. You know, I don't actually know if that would be the case today, and I certainly would be hesitant to attempt that in the United States. So it was an interesting time, and on average, a very positive experience. And so I was sort of, I was kind of realizing my National Geographic vision, traveling around, collecting samples, taking students. Those Australians, you have to get used to their terseness. They're pretty direct. But I will say that to a family, it's remarkable how welcoming they were. I mean, you know, a tall black guy with a Yankee accent. I mean, it's just, I could imagine all kinds of receptions, but it was really remarkable how broad their vision was and how welcoming they were. I've actually had some interest in fieldwork as a practice for a long time. In 2013, I organized a symposium at the Evolution meetings on expeditionary biology. And here's just some of the characters. I don't know if you can read this. But, you know, I was still in the kind of National Geographic mode. Here's Paul Sereno, the famous paleontologist chasing after dinosaurs. Here's folks looking in the deep sea. Here's folks drilling, you know, miles underneath the Antarctic ice looking for microbes. I was and I still remain just excited about the lengths that humans will go to learn about the planet. And so that's been a really passionate interest of mine. On the other hand, some of you might be aware that the very term fieldwork is under question. You know, the social science folks are claiming that it might serve as a trigger for unwanted memories of certain groups, field perhaps hearkening to colonialism or slavery. That's a tough one. There are people pushing back, I would suppose. I think in this room we're all comfortable using it. I suppose it's something that we should be mindful of. Now, I landed in the MCZ in about 2003, and it's a remarkable zoological storehouse of biodiversity. The bird collections used to be up on the 5th floor of this brick building. One day the dean wandered up there, you know, admiring the beautiful view over Cambridge, and said, "Why are we holding 400,000 dead birds up here when we could be opening this to living people?" And so as a result, the collections moved, thankfully, remaining on campus, they moved to the basement of a building just next door. And actually the facilities now are really impressive. But, you know, part of my mission as a teacher, I think, is to instill upon students an understanding of biodiversity, an appreciation for biodiversity. You know, as many of you know, a lot of the ology courses at universities, ornithology, herpetology, entomology, they're getting cut in favor of fields that are deemed more synthetic, more cutting edge. But I will tell you, having taught ornithology for a couple decades now, that it's one of the most integrative courses that and it's a challenging course to teach, because I'm talking about paleontology, I'm talking about fossils, conservation, physiology, anatomy, behavior, ecology. Those are tough fields to traverse. So I think the ologies are very important for that. And of course, we learn a lot about our environment. These are a recent study from a few years ago, actually instigated by an undergraduate at Harvard. She wanted to know whether seabirds, such as this black-footed albatross, were being impacted by heavy metals. You know, despite their living on colonies in the remote Pacific, could they also be sort of suffering from heavy metals such as mercury? And so she put together a neat project. We ended up collaborating with folks from the Harvard School of Public Health. And we using just a single feather from these specimens, we showed that organic mercury was in fact increasing over time. We were able to sample albatrosses from our collection going back to the 1880s. And so Jared Diamond once wrote an editorial in Nature entitled "Why Old Dead Rats Are Useful." And this is the kind of thing that I think is important. You know, we were just talking about archiving field notes. We don't even know the uses that will come from these specimens in a few decades, and so it behooves us to squirrel a few away. Modern museums today are really, they're just playgrounds for all kinds of amazing technologies, from physics, chemistry, ancient DNA. The MCZ is, we have a really amazing cryo collection where we're archiving tissue samples, blood samples, anything from which you can retrieve macromolecules. And you know, I think of these specimens not just as specimens, but really as snapshots of the environment of a specific time and place. You can get pollen from these Hawaiian honeycreepers, find out what flowers they've been visiting. You can look at the mites in their feathers. You can do stable isotopes on their feathers and think about their diets. And so, the more we can bring different sciences to bear on these specimens in a way that Mike Webster at Cornell has called the extended specimen, we can really reap the amazing secrets that they hold. Now, as I've mentioned already, museums have this troubling legacy of racism and colonialism. And of course, Louis Agassiz, as many of you know, was a virulent racist. He most recently was found to have archived photos of slaves that were in the Peabody Museum, our sister museum, and causing a lot of consternation among descendants of those individuals. He was very famous, of course, for his work on glaciers, but he also had this very troubling today at a time when many Victorians were thinking more broadly about human diversity. He was very much retrograde in his views. And so when we moved the bird collection from that fifth floor area to the basement of the adjacent building, we actually exposed these chalkboards for the first time in about 150 years, which was really, really remarkable. And as a inveterate prankster, I just couldn't resist having a little fun. I'm not a very good invertebrate biologist, but I think I can match some of that gravitas that you see. But I also wanted to mention that, Agassiz would be mortified, if he knew I was curator of birds. There is a really exciting group of folks getting together, trying to celebrate African Americans in natural history museums, run by a very energetic grad student at University of Florida. We just had a fun meeting at the AMNH, and I encourage you to look up their website. Okay, so my lab's sort of way of parsing the world is sort of divided into three areas here. Fieldwork is one of the areas of this triangle that I still participate in. I dropped the lab work years ago, and graduate students, when I enter the lab, they get nervous because I'm probably going to break something. And computation, of course, is now a big part of it, something that I've tried to keep up with a little bit. But what I want to emphasize is just the challenges that come not just with field work, but with being a comparative biologist in the field. So a comparative biologist is someone who compares populations, species, and of course there are comparative ethnologists and anthropologists as well. And one thing I've struggled with is how to sort of develop deep roots into any one community, when in order to study your clade or lineage, you've got to move around. This is a phylogeny here on the right, and those species in your study might be spread not only broadly within one continent, but on different continents. And that's been sort of a challenge, I would say, to balancing integration and contribution to local communities with having to spread yourself thin geographically. One area where we've had some success is in this NSF-funded Dimensions of Biodiversity project, which was focused on the dry diagonal, the Cerrado and Caatinga habitats of Brazil. These are areas that are sort of sandwiched in between the Amazon and the Atlantic rainforest, and have, frankly, received a lot less attention from scientists. But we were able to work with a really extraordinary group of scientists in Brazil. This is, I think, an example of NSF trying to make us co-create, which a lot of what NSF does is trying to push the community to a better spot. And I think this was a nice example. We had several planning meetings before we got the grant, and we basically improved on each other's knowledge to try to make a compelling project. And my student Kelsey, who is here, she's there on the left there. She has, I think, experienced some of these challenges of working on, in her case, a very interesting group of birds known as antbirds, but trying to look at their full diversity, and in particular, to look at how they've adapted to dry habitats. Most of this clade is found in a very moist lowland rainforest areas, some montane forests. Only a few examples where they've radiated out to dry habitats. But you can see that these habitats are far flung. They're not conveniently in one spot. How are you going to access all those? I think Kelsey's done that admirably through collaborators and whatnot, but you can see how it might cause us to have to move around a lot, which could, if there may be a trade-off with integrating into any one community. My student, Sophie Orzakowski, who just defended in the spring, she did an amazing dissertation down in Australia looking at genetics of Australian honey eaters. You know, for any graduate students that want to come to my lab, I look for ability to do field work. A lot of young folks pride themselves on running computer programs or this or that or math. They're all important. But actually, I think field work is undervalued by our admissions committees, by our administrators. We've heard this before at this conference. But we all know that pulling off a field program, especially overseas, is a multi-year and very, very challenging endeavor. And so Sophie's done that to really a great degree. I also just want to highlight another lab colleague, Inbar Mayan, who's also here. And she has really, I think, shown us in our lab meetings that we have every week how to integrate locals into your field projects. She's just done an amazing job traversing all over Jamaica, benefiting from local knowledge, but also contributing in terms of teaching folks how to sample lizards in her case, dispelling them of beliefs that lizards are somehow, dangerous and going to eat you up. And so through that sort of education, she has probably gone a long way towards helping preserve biodiversity. Hopefully when locals encounter anolis lizards, they won't have the first inclination to sort of smash them with a brick or something. So the upshot of all this is that, for better or worse, my lab has traveled the globe. I put this somewhat blurry figure up, not to boast about where we've been, but to simply emphasize that I've drunk deep that global perspective. Many of our museums in the country have not a regional perspective, but a global perspective, and all the baggage that comes with that. I will add that this map is actually kind of interesting. It was published with a special projection in 2021, which turns out to have the least distortion and to capture the continents as accurately in terms of their relative size as any projection thus far. It was invented by a couple astronomers at Princeton. And so, anyway, it's a nice way to depict, and I'm going to be putting a script on GitHub as to how to make your own map. This was done entirely by ChatGPT. So, there are cases where we see interesting global scale initiatives that nonetheless are able to penetrate into their communities and improve infrastructure and local learning. I point to one example, the Forest Geo project, which is a worldwide project trying to measure the growth and ecology of tropical forests. And they have plots in many different countries. But at the same time, their infrastructure is vast enough that they can actually contribute to local infrastructure and contribute to training the next generation. And I think this is an interesting case of a very widely flung project that has nonetheless contributed substantively to many local communities. So you can see from their mission statement that they're deeply committed to training young scientists and learning new skills and gaining access to a network of data and shared experience. Forest Geo initiatives ensure that benefits derived from the global syntheses are shared across geographic scales. Another similar project closer to home is the Golondrinas de las Americas project run by folks at Cornell and other places. This project is actually trying to study a genus of swallows which migrates from North to South America every year. And by studying these swallows in many different locations, they're able to get a very rich window into their life history and ecology. And my understanding is that they've been able to do this in collaboration with scientists in many different South American countries, and to do it in a way that having exchanges and whatnot, student exchanges, in a way that's really benefiting those communities. So this trade-off between sort of geographic and scale and engagement at the local levels may not be an absolute one. Now, the other Achilles heel of the work I do is that, I'm a museum person. I collect specimens to study and learn about biodiversity. But of course, this is, it's a challenging topic. As I'll show you over the next few slides, on the one hand, students and the public are enamored of specimens. They love natural history museums. They flock to them in droves. And yet, it's almost as if the broader public isn't connecting the dots. How did these specimens get there? Here's an example from a colleague, Chris Filardi, who was at the AMNH, where it just went wrong. The rollout of his field work, sadly, he was studying a poorly known kingfisher, the mustache kingfisher in the Solomon Islands. He held, they had sort of ad campaigns about his field work and webinars, and for a while, the public was really enjoying his stories of the field until they learned that he had sacrificed one individual. At that point, the tide turned 180 degrees, and he was basically the recipient of a barrage of hate mail and harassment. This received a lot of press at the time. There are other examples of things gone wrong. A research, for example, in Australia, studying golden bowerbirds. She wanted to learn about their vision. She needed eyes. She did so in a place which was not as secluded and from public eye as she might have, and there was a huge outcry. And of course, incidents like this can damage the way forward for many scientists in those fields going forward. So there's this weird sensitivity to sacrificing individuals for scientific research, while at the same time we enjoy many of the fruits of that research. The debate over destructive sampling was played out on web. Many animal rights groups, of course, decrying it, whereas, good for them, the National Audubon Society, a conservation organization, stepping up and allowing Chris to defend himself in their pages. Chris wrote very poignantly about his decision to sacrifice this one bird. Reports in the press that this was a rare species are not true. He estimated at least 4,000 individuals, which even on a single island is a reasonably healthy population. But he tried to convey the deep bonds he had with local communities in the Solomon Islands. He tried to convey what many of us who work in museums have seen many times, and that is the sheer wonder and engagement that people have with specimens. And in the end, his work did mobilize lots of conservation efforts that might not have happened. When people see physical evidence of a species, it has an immediacy which often causes them to as a call to action. So, but it's this weird tightrope line where, we have to navigate, we celebrate the fruits of these scientific endeavors, but not the activities themselves. Well, I can tell you, though, that students love specimens. They love them. Most of them even love anatomy when we're tearing apart a big cormorant or something like that. They bring an immediacy of the biology to students that you simply can't get looking at slides or other representations. And so it's one of the two best parts of my ornithology courses, according to the students, are the field trips, of course, but then working in the collections, learning about biodiversity through these amazing collections. And as I mentioned already, the public also loves collections. They love natural history museums. And so there's this sort of strange disconnect between our discourse around museums and the act by which those museums were populated with specimens. Many of you may be aware that natural history collections are in a bit of a challenging time right now. They've always been challenged by fields that are perceived to be more legitimate, more cutting edge, bringing in more research dollars to universities. This is just a plot that shows, sorry, it's a bit blurry. You've got time on the x-axis and basically number of growth of collections on the y for different vertebrate groups, amphibians, birds, mammals, et cetera. And you can see that there's, a steady rise up to the sort of pre-war period, and then it becomes very uncertain, with the more recent trend, which you see here on the bottom, being one of declining contributions to the collections. This is troubling because I think we should continue responsible collecting. I think it would be a disservice to future generations. They're going to look back at what we have collected for them in 100 years, just like Grinnell was imagining future students would look back in California. And to the extent to which we haven't documented our biodiversity today, we're not going to know in 100 years what things were like at our time. So, now, like many of you, in my own way, I've tried to give back. I've been really privileged to run an undergraduate program where we bring students to the annual Evolution meetings. We pair them up with a mentor to basically navigate the complexity of these meetings. And we think it's a nice inflection point for them. Many of them have never been to a scientific meeting, and it's great to see the grad students and postdocs learning their own mentoring skills and bringing these students along with them. Now, many disciplines in biology, zoology, and the geosciences are becoming aware of the challenges of field work for people of color as well, but all of us, I think, experience many of these challenges to some degree. Remarkably, much of this discourse was initiated by the death of George Floyd. I think we would all admit that that pivotal event sent shockwaves through academia and sort of woke us all up, jolted us to awareness of some of the challenges of fieldwork and biology and the disciplines that we engage in. But there are bright spots, and I think even at this fraught intersection of genomics and biodiversity, just some recent examples of cases where project leaders have embedded themselves deeply in local communities. In the case of the bilby on the left, in the inland Aboriginal communities, Indigenous Australians, and on the right, in the Indigenous Maori communities of New Zealand. And so there are examples where we can co-create projects. There's a lot of interesting work going. You probably saw the press release of folks are going to sequence the genome of a giant moa and resurrect it. I don't know if that'll actually happen, but the important thing is that it was done in a way that was highly consultative and basically had people, locals and indigenous groups from the beginning helping to craft the project. And that's obviously the way forward. I've been very fortunate to assist in some of the really more impactful programs in my own experience. I think we'll hear more about impactful programs like this from folks like Paul Barber tomorrow. But there are pockets of programs that are doing their best to expose undergraduates from diverse backgrounds to the importance of conservation, to become comfortable in the field. You can imagine the distance that students have to travel if they haven't spent time in nature as a kid is pretty far. And so programs like the UCSC Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program, or the new version of it, which has now been called the Conservation Leadership Immersion Experience. These are programs designed to get students comfortable working in the field, thinking like a biological scientist. And for me, globetrotting around the world, I have tried to establish local friendships, mutual trust. I think I've left many of the places I've visited in a better place. We often leave thousands of dollars of equipment with our collaborators in Mongolia, for example. But it's something that's certainly been raised more in my mind, not only as a result of this conference, but just going forward with all the challenges we have. And as many of you probably know, I've even gone so far as to explore my own country on 2 wheels in 2020 in an effort to avoid all the Zoom meetings that administrators were going to send my way as we were sitting at home. I just decided to get on my bike and ride across country. And appropriate perhaps to just mention this briefly here, because most of the second half of my trip was traveling in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. And one of the high points of my trip was visiting the headwaters of Missouri State Park. This really should be a national park in Montana. But this was where, of course, the 3 rivers come together to form the headwaters of the Missouri, which, of course, was the goal of Jefferson's goal for the Lewis and Clark expedition. And seeing, in this really beautiful spot where York the slave on the expedition was part of, I felt this very intense sense of history in that park, but also across the whole country. It was just a great opportunity to connect with folks that come from very different backgrounds. Birds, I found, were always a great conversation starter. And it was just, I felt fortunate to be able to connect with people who, some of whom, certainly I wasn't sharing political views with, and some might even be skeptical of science and the scientific endeavor. But I did my best to try to bridge that divide. And so, yeah, it was a great opportunity, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk. As you're thinking about the future of fieldwork and you're thinking about students and things like that, you're talking about how, as you're considering students, you wish admissions committees were looking more at fieldwork. How do you judge if someone's ready for fieldwork, given that you were saying that opportunities are definitely disparate, especially early in careers or early in life? So how do you measure that, or how do you determine who gets the thumbs up on that?
No, that's a really good point, because of course we don't want to fall into the trap of, accepting folks that have had opportunities or had, privilege, whatever. Yeah, no, it's, it's one of these things, you have to be pragmatic, I think. I'm sure many of you have been in the same position. But, and of course you might have to change your expectations for some students. And, in truth, most students applying to our program have had some feel they at least know whether they like it or not. And I think the thing that we're able to do at Harvard, thankfully, is to give students opportunity. In many cases, finances are not a barrier. We have small endowments to help facilitate specifically for field work. And, you start them out mist netting birds out at the Concord Field Station outside of Boston, and if they want to take that further, that's great. Some inevitably get sucked into the rabbit hole of bioinformatics and never go into the field again. But I think most of my students have really navigated well that balance. And I think, one of the things that I'm seeing more recently is really exciting is sort of graduate students sort of co-conducting field work, which I think is great because, they can learn from each other different ways of navigating the complex landscape. So, yeah.
I have a kind of related question. Thanks, Scott. And so I'm a historian, so my question comes as somebody that's a humanist, and I think a lot of historians, humanists, we look across the campus at those science buildings and all the ologies and just assume you all are flush with money and funding. And so it was interesting to hear you talk about the challenges that ornithology and other similar fields are facing in terms of decisions that are being made about funding in the future. So options do somebody that's a graduate student at Harvard or somebody else that wants to pursue ornithology, a PhD, but maybe the opportunities on campuses to get a professorship are diminishing? What type of career pathways do they have outside of the academy?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Patrick. I mean, I think, yeah, and that's something, again, that I think my generation of professors has had to grapple with. Like, okay, we have to take our blinders off and realize that sometimes students might want to do something else. Like, I mean, after being in academics for a couple of decades, I get it. I understand why you might want to do something else. You know, yeah, I think the one thing that we try to instill upon students is an appreciation of their own skill sets. I mean, you may be working on the most obscure problem in biogeography or taxonomy or whatever, but you're often developing skills that will be useful to you in lots of other endeavors. It could be collaboration, it could be logistics, it could be analyzing biological data. And so, you know, many grad students and postdocs end up going into human genetics, bioinformatics, conservation informatics. There's a real need for folks. I mean, getting a PhD, we all know, you learn so much more than just your subject matter. And I think what's important is that we make students aware of those opportunities early, and that we don't sort of write them off if they say, well, maybe I don't want to become a professor. I mean, that's, and so, and I think that the skills that we can bestow on our students, just in terms of analyzing data, are going to be very important in other endeavors too. As to the gleaming research buildings that you mentioned, you know, there's competition at every level, and I will tell you, I hope they're listening at Harvard. You know, the molecular biologists are always ruling, the stem cell folks, they're ruling the day, and so it's like we have to chain ourselves to our collections, make sure that they stay there. So, yeah.
Hi.
You can take
thank
one more
you.
question.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much. I just wanted to reflect back on a couple of things that you said. One, you talked about having to spread yourself thin across different communities because of doing comparative work, right? If you're taking that perspective in biology or other fields, and that sort of, you know, limits the amount of depth of friendships and so on that you can, you know, you're not going to have sustained relations if you're moving around. And it recalls a linguist named Laura Robinson who works on Philippine languages and did field work, was doing historical linguistic work. So what she needed was 200 word lists from a lot of different communities. And, you know, she went around doing that work and people were happy to host her and help her, and she compensated them generously, and then, you know, came back and wrote up her research. But, you know, in a climate where collaboration is so valued, she found herself really having to, you know, defend what she did as ethical research, and even wrote a paper, not about cowboy linguistics, but the lone wolf, that was it, lone wolf linguistics, and, you know, really just finding herself caught in that discourse. So I just wanted to mention that as a kind of affirmation of that observation. And then just a quick second one, you talked about the kind of trends of devaluing collections. And I'll just point out that the Documenting Endangered Languages program at NSF, right, which is really important for sponsoring linguistic field work around the world, had to change its name for political reasons to DLI from DEL, Documenting Endangered Languages, to Dynamic Language Infrastructure. And the people who were applying for that program were like, huh, what, okay, whatever, we'll call it what you want. But I think it just is really reinforcing your point about that value. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm all for changing names. If it lets the bullets fly over us, I'm all for it.
You had a question.
Really great talk. This example that you gave of the outrage about the one bird, I think it highlights a broader issue that I'm not sure how we as professionals working in this area navigate. So, there's an outrage over that bird. In my field, there was blackfish. It's just like, oh my God, how could you possibly keep an orca in captivity? Their backlashes against zoos. And the people having those responses don't realize that the reason that they push back against that so much is that they've had that exposure. And it's that exposure that's made them care. And now they care so much that they want those things to go away. But how do we, it's about zoos, it's about aquaria, it's about field collections. But, I can see where this eventually gets to, like, why do we need to do field work? Like, why are you torturing those birds, like, with mist nets? Like, why are you capturing those fish underwater and, like, doing whatever you do to them? How do we simultaneously get people to care enough to, want to protect these organisms, protect these ecosystems, at the same time, not completely shutting down, like, the scientific endeavors and the communication mechanisms that got them to care in the first place?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I will say that my thought is that they probably would be more outraged someone collecting a bird than a sea urchin. But that's the price we pay as ornithologists. But no, your point is very well taken, and I think it takes dialogue. We have to talk to folks. A lot of the exchange isn't driven by logic so much as emotion, and I think talking to folks, trying to place the field work and the research in context. How is it going to help the broader society? These are all things, of course, that we're all doing, but I agree with you that we've just got to engage and try to get beyond the shouting matches and just talk.